Alrighty, so this is the third time I'm now testing my ability to live stream. So hopefully this has come out clearer. So welcome to PM Corner. I am here to discuss project management concepts and apply them to projects that have been done in the past. That would include projects that had been done in the past that were failures and also successes. It just depends, but what we're trying to do is take PM concepts and make them applicable. But before we even begin on that, I would like to simply introduce myself. So, of course, I am a project management professional in the real world, and I also do tutoring for project management students in college, both our undergrad and master's degree. But I also do project management professional exam preparation tutoring, as well as mentoring. So, of course, I have noticed consistently with my students is the question of how do I make PMI's project management concepts applicable to the real world? Because even though the exam forces professionals to pretty much abandon everything they've learned in the real world and um, basically have to go by the PMBOK standard, what ends up happening is that then they're kind of questioning, well, what do I do? How do I make this applicable? How do I go about this? And so the point of this channel is to basically do just that. Make things applicable to the real world and allow the, anyone, not even just professionals, but anyone to look at project management concepts and apply them to projects. So, of course, I do have various social media links on my about specifically. I do have specific direct links, but I do also have a link tree in case you wanted to check out my tutoring profile or if you wanted to look at my Udemy profile and see my various courses that I have. There's only one so far on how to use Microsoft Project. I am working on another one for project management professional certification training as well. But then I also do tutoring, as I said. I do have a TikTok, which I generally post the most on. So that's where I do updates about live streams. That's where I post about my courses, my services, that sort of thing. But I also have a YouTube channel that I'm going to post the videos to as well. Well, really the live streams, if they are of good quality and sound. And then that way you can see them not only on Twitch, but you can also go to my YouTube channel and I might try to post some of the videos in like 3-minute clips or something on TikTok so you have the ability to see them in all platforms. Now, there is a PayPal link that I do include. It's just for donations. So if you're able to donate, great. If you're not, that's okay too. As I would like to say, donations are accepted but not expected, and we would appreciate your support in being able to continue this channel. So, of course, I'm going to talk about the structure of the stream. So, after this particular stream, we're going to cover the basics of the PM concepts really quickly, and then we're going to discuss the topic. Now, as I said, this topic can be about past projects that were failures and successes. But what we're trying to do is understand first the summary of the project. What was it about? What happened, good or bad? The key points, good or bad, to understand then how that applies to the different phases and processes of project management and how the 7 key points, which we'll discuss as well, may have been ignored or not ignored depending on, of course, success or failure. And then I may give a conclusion which may have an opinion, may not have an opinion. It will depend. But I might not do it. But then at the end, what I hope to do is have a QA/discussion about the topic that was just discussed. So if at any point during the stream you feel like I'm not looking at your comments, please be patient with me. But if you really want that question answered, you can either save it at the end during the Q&A discussion, or you can reach out to me through message via Twitch, YouTube, or TikTok, and I will promptly answer as quickly as I can. So, with that said, let's get down to the basics of project management. So, we have phases of a project, which is initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. So, initiating is where we are trying to understand the business value of the project, meaning, does this project provide any kind of value that would be beneficial for not just the client and also not just for the project manager who runs it, but also for society, depending on what that is. Now, of course, as I said, the essential point of initiating is understanding business value, which feeds the business case, which is stating why we're doing this, and the benefits management plan, which is stating what are we getting out of it, which then those two documents feed into the project charter. Now, the project charter is very important because, again, it's high level in terms of what the client's looking for, meaning scope, but not exactly. It may have something high level in terms of schedule, so maybe milestones, but nothing more than that. It may also include constraints, such as really in general in the real world, it's usually budget and time are the main constraints. But of course, what's important is that both you, the project manager and key personnel, and the stakeholders sign and agree to that project charter. Which, of course, I'm going to say this. If you reach the project charter point and you decide that it's not really worthwhile, then obviously you really hadn't done your due diligence in identifying the business value of the project in the first place. But of course, once you receive approval and sign off on the project charter, then you move into what is called the planning phase. And during the planning phase is where you really detail plan out all of your processes for the project. And of course, keep in mind you can tailor these processes based on the needs of your project. You don't have to do them exactly the same way as you would for complex projects. Maybe there's a lot more steps, a lot more complexity versus a small project that's not really complex. You probably don't want to do that level. But the important part of planning is that you then create the project management plan, which we'll get into a little more detail about. But really, what the project management plan does is it lays out your foundation, your blueprint, and roadmap of how you're going to do the processes from beginning to end. Now, of course, if you're thinking about agile in terms of planning, now, yes, even though you may not have an idea of details in terms of your scope, that doesn't mean you're not going to know how to do your processes and you're not going to wait to progressively elaborate on your processes. That doesn't make sense. You need to know what your processes are, what you're going to do with your processes, and how you're going to manage those processes and perform those processes. So it's very important to detail plan that out. Now, in non-agile projects, whether they're hybrid or what we call traditional or waterfall, you would detail plan out your scope to understand what it is you're asked to do by the client. We'll get into that when we talk about the processes for scope. But it is important to understand that at the end of the day, you need to detail plan out. And of course, once you've done that, then you would get review and approval of the project management plan by your client or your stakeholders, obviously. And then what's important to understand is once that's approved, then you host what is called a kickoff meeting. And the kickoff meeting is where you sit with the client and you basically go through the project management plan and gain understanding of what is going to happen from beginning to end and that everyone understands how things are done. Now, of course, in the real world, there isn't a whole lot of that done in terms of kickoffs. Generally, what I've experienced in my, profession is that kickoffs usually just kind of are like, "Hey, we're doing this, yay!" But there's not a real discussion about, well, okay, so here's our processes. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. Do you understand? Do we agree that this makes sense, right? But also, they're very uncommon because people just tend to, get the project and then just start actually doing the work. Now, there is a real world example if you do government contracting, though, is what is called an integrated baseline review, or an IBR. And that's actually similar to what a project kickoff in the PMBOK is like. You do exactly that, where you review your documents, your schedule, your budget, the whole nines, all of it. Then you move, once you've done the kickoff meeting, of course, you then move into the executing, monitoring, controlling phases. Now, you keep in mind that executing, monitoring, controlling happen at the same time, but they do different things. And so in the PMBOK, we have things called work performance data, work performance information, and reports. Now, of course, for those of you, if you're studying the PMBOK, this probably already sounds familiar, but for those of you that don't, that's perfectly okay. So in executing, you're doing exactly that. You're executing what you said you're going to do. And so that creates work performance data, because as a result of executing, you're creating data. And so then at the same time of doing monitoring and controlling, you then are taking that work performance data and turning it into work performance information through analyzing and understanding what is going on with that data, to then create reports that you share, both whether internally or with only your stakeholders or all that are involved. But what becomes important, and we'll further discuss it, is that you need to then determine, do you need to make a change or not, based upon what that data is telling you. And we'll get more into that when we talk about integrated change control as one of the 7 key items. But of course, just to also keep in mind, because agile fundamentalists like to say that, we're always continuously progressively elaborating, so we're always planning and then executing, monitoring, controlling, and then rinse and repeat. Well, in project management, we call that incremental or iterative, right? So that's where, and unlike agile, you can kind of more predetermine that yourself. Versus in agile, we obviously know that there's always, planning at the beginning of the sprint. Then you execute, you demo, you do a retrospective, then you go through the process again. And that's more, I would say, defined. But of course, you can do the same thing even in non-agile projects. And then at the end of the project, because by definition, a project is a temporary endeavor with a definitive beginning and end, creating a unique product, service, or result, we then come to the closing phase, which is where we get final approval of the product, service, or result that we created from the project. We also get feedback from those stakeholders about our performance. Did they like us or not? Which, let's just be honest, you're not going to make everyone happy. So, just be ready for that. And then we're also archiving all of our data. So all the documents we created, all the data we analyzed, including lessons learned, which we'll talk about that as well. And also your project charter, project management plans. And that goes into the historical repositories of the OPAs, or the organizational process assets, which we'll talk about more as well. So now that we talked about the phases of a project, we now have the processes of a project. So there's integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholder. So the first process we're going to talk about is integration management. Now, integration management, I like to describe this to my students as this. The project is an engine. The other processes, scope all the way to the stakeholder, are individual gears that move and do things on their own because they have their own processes. Now, obviously, if they're just kind of out there on their own doing their own thing, well, that's not going to be of any use, and that's not going to make the project successful. That's where integrated chain or integration management comes into play. It is the belt that loops around all those gears and brings them all together to work as a cohesive whole to make the project run. The other thing about integration management is that it is the only process in project management that touches all the phases of a project, beginning to end. So no matter what you do, no matter what process you're in, no matter what phase you're in, integration management is part of it, period. And it's very important because it is the one process that has the business value, project charter, project management plan, and integrated change control process. And we'll, again, talk about those in a little bit. Then we have scope, which basically is the requirements. What are you building and how you're going to do it? And what's your client looking for in terms of the detail of those requirements? Now, here's a couple things. First and foremost, clients have interesting ideas sometimes. um, and of course, clients don't always keep in mind why they're doing things in the first place. Why are we doing this project anyways? So then what ends up happening is sometimes they get harebrained ideas and they pitch them as if that should be a requirement and that should be part of this project scope and therefore we should do it. Well, here's the thing. As a project manager, no, I'm not saying you have to immediately say no to every little thing your client suggests as potential scope, but you need to first understand whether or not that scope, well, is it going to align with the business value of the project based on the project charter? Is it going to align? If it doesn't, then you kind of have to determine, is it just random scope that has no business being part of your project as a whole? Or is it scope that belongs to a different project and not your current project? Again, you can still say no and it's okay. It's allowed. In the real world, if you are a project manager or in the project management field, you've probably seen time and time again that there are project managers that just say yes to every little thing the client asks, which is not always a good thing because that leads to a lot of issues. Because scope, cost, and schedule are pretty much the triangle of death if you don't do things properly. Which thus leads into schedule, because if you know what you're building, then you know how long it's going to take you based on how you build out your schedule for the activities to fulfill that scope. Now, of course, again, if you don't know what you're building, you're not going to have an idea of when you're going to be done. Same thing with cost. So if you don't know what you're building and how long it's going to take you, then you don't know how much it's going to cost you to do it, which means you don't know the resources or the quality or anything else. As you can tell, it's a snowball effect from those three. Then the next process is quality, which obviously is meeting the standards and requirements of your industry, but also meeting the expectations of your client. So your requirements will have some level of quality in it. Now, of course, the cost chapter does talk about the cost of quality, which means if you're not willing to invest in some way, shape, or form in ensuring that you have the best quality standards for your project possible, you will run into a lot of issues when it comes to defects of your product. And also the potential that you're going to have to rework so many things that then increases cost and time and everything else in between. The next piece is, of course, the resources. Now, resources aren't just people. Resources also include your machines, if you're like manufacturing, for example, or if you're building something, and also other things like materials and so forth. And that's basically what that is at the end of the day. It's not just about people. And your next process is communication management, which is where you're managing the communication flow and ensuring that everyone is getting the right information at the right time to act accordingly. Because obviously, if you're not communicating well with your stakeholders, how can they help you remove blockers, impediments, and issues? So, very important to also understand your communications. Now, the next piece is risk. Now, like scope, cost, and schedule, there's a lot of heavy planning that needs to be done for risk as well. Because again, the PM triangle is essential, it affects everything else. So if you don't plan those out well, you're going to be in a lot of problems. Just like if you don't do your due diligence in identifying all your risk as much as possible, you're going to have a lot of issues when a risk occurs and you had not set aside the necessary funds or time to, well, not or, and time to be able to address it. And so in risk management, we do talk about how there's reserves and contingency. So reserves are for known unknowns, meaning those are risks that you have identified and have set aside cost and time because you know what your mitigation strategy is when it occurs. Now, keep in mind, as you build and and perform and build your project, you should be able to at least minimize the risk, not eliminate, because it's kind of not possible, because you're always going to have some kind of risk that's still kind of there, but minimize it and minimize its impact, definitely. Then the other type is contingency, which is for unknown unknowns, meaning there are just risks that you don't know will happen until you're executing. And yeah, while that's not fun and it feels unfair, that is the reality. Like, you're not going to capture every single risk. But if you're not doing your due diligence, you're just being blatantly negligent and not keeping up and making sure that your project is planned out well. Then the next process is procurement management. Now, of course, procurement is pretty basic in understanding, is that you're procuring specific tools, products, whatever that is that you need to do. But procurement management also talks about different contract types. And in the real world, based on my experience, most of the time it's been cost type contracts, but there is fixed price contracts, cost contracts, and then time and material or a purchase order, right? But we'll just focus on fixed and cost contracts. So fixed price contracts basically means that you know exactly what you're building, and it's the same way for how you do it every single time, and therefore you just know that if I'm, like, for example, building a house, it's going to cost this amount no matter what, because of material and labor and everything else in between. Whereas cost contracts are more meant for more complex and less identifiable scope of a project. And because of that, you have a little more flexibility in basically requesting certain types of, or certain amounts of money, because you're not really sure completely what your scope is. But again, this is why you either do agile, one, or two, you just do progressive elaboration, even if you're not agile, to ensure that you are making sure you're capturing all your scope, which means you're making sure you're capturing all your costs and your schedule and your risks and so forth. And then finally, there's stakeholder management. And what stakeholder management is that you're just managing your stakeholders. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, though, is that in the initiating phase, you are identifying all your stakeholders as much as you can. Why? Because stakeholders contribute to the scope management process of identifying your requirements or your scope. And so if you don't do your due diligence in that and you find a stakeholder you hadn't identified in the past, that can completely and utterly throw your entire project off. And then you have to redo your cost and your schedule and everything. But the other thing too is that you're trying to identify who is an influencer and who's kind of not an influencer, who's a change driver and who's not, because you're also then identifying, are they supporting your project? Meaning they're like, you're 100% your cheerleader. They're there to ensure that you are successful and they want to see the project successful. Or are they kind of in between? They're like, meh, I'm not too worried whether you're successful or not. Or are they the type of stakeholder that wants to see you fail? Meaning they just want to see you fail and they'll make it happen one way or another. And that is where you have to identify them so that you're able to not only make the people that support you happy, but also persuade, engage, and keep engaged the people who are laissez-faire about your project and the people who want to see your project fail. And so finally, we come to the 7 key items that we always must remember. And I tell this to my project management students because it helps them remember, because when they start reading, more particularly Rita's PMP prep exam book, because that's makes understanding the PMBOK a lot easier versus reading the PMBOK, which is like reading, Tolkien, who goes into 10 pages about the history of a tree, and then you realize you don't even know what you just read. That's how the PMBOK is to me. Some people can read it and understand it, good for them, but most that I've seen can't really understand what the PMBOK's saying. So the PMP prep exam book by Rita's is perfect for that. But so the first thing we must make sure of is that we understand business value. Business value, business value, business value. I will continue to harp on that until I'm blue in the face and all that. Because if you don't understand your business value, then that means you don't understand why you're doing the project, and therefore, why are you doing the project anyways? And then, of course, the next piece is the There we go. Lost my headphone for a minute. Then the project charter is the next item that we need to make sure that we are aware of and keeping in mind, because the project charter is always referred back to when you write out the project management plan, because again, it lays out the business value, the why we're doing this and what we're getting out of it. And then, of course, the project management plan, as I also mentioned, is very important because that is your blueprint and your roadmap of how you're going to perform all these processes from beginning to end of the project. Then the next item that we need to keep in mind is the enterprise environmental factors, or also known as EEFs. EEFs are, things that you can't control as a project manager. Meaning, no matter what you do, even if you had a crystal ball and had the ability to control time or whatever, you can't control an EEF. So, most times when we think of EEFs in the real world, we think of, you know, uh, external EEFs, which are like government policies and procedures, different organizations within the government that have effect on how we do business. Political and social climate also has an effect on the project. Because, for example, if you got your project located in some state or country that ends up being in turmoil, well, that's going to affect you because maybe you have to worry about the safety of your people. You may have to consider relocation, all that fun jazz. But then there's also internal EEFs, which is more related to your organization as a whole. And so your organization as a whole can have, if they have like a hierarchical structure, then you might have a lot of issues in terms of approval process, a lot of red tape, so on and so forth, and that can affect and delay your project in getting certain approvals or getting certain things done, so forth. Also, another one can be geographic location. So if you've got people who are located in different places, then you're going to have a hard time trying to coordinate between different time zones and understanding cultural differences and so forth. So that those play a huge role when it comes to project management. Another one is organizational process assets. Now, earlier I was talking about OPAs because OPAs are categorized into two types. You've got policies and procedures, but they're for the overall organization, not just the project. So when you think of organization policies and procedures, think of your employee handbook. That's where it tells you how to, request vacation, how do you accrue PTO and sick leave. I don't know who does this still, but in some cases, even dress code, how you should dress. Is it business casual? Is it business formal? That sort of stuff. Then you also have in your OPAs historical repositories. This is where you basically have the knowledge of previous projects that your organization has done, and what happens is that future projects can go back into those knowledge repositories and look at how projects, whether they failed or not, what they did in terms of certain processes and procedures. Sometimes it can also help in understanding if we've worked with previous clients before and how was that project with them in the past and maybe what could be done differently for the new project, etc. Then, of course, you have a thing called lessons learned. Lessons learned in Agile tends to be done in the retrospective, which is where you try to understand what you did right, what you did wrong, and what you can do to improve. Lessons learned does the same thing, but it's not as defined in terms of when you do it, unlike in Agile, where you know at the end of every sprint, you're going to do a retrospective. Whereas with lessons learned in project management, you can do it incrementally or as often or as not as often as you like, although not recommended, but you know, it just depends. And so then you have the understanding of what needs to be done differently. But then, in addition to that, you may also have technical find outs that you may have seen, such as, like, for example, oh, we thought this environment was configured properly, but then as we were executing, we realized it wasn't. So we've implemented a new quality management strategy in terms of ensuring it. That's an example. Project management processes are also another example of not or just making sure that you learn from maybe improving a process. Maybe you realize during executing that a certain business process was much easier to be automated versus, kind of leaving it the way it is. And various other things are also documented in your lessons learned. Then finally, I also touched upon this a little bit too, is the integrated change control process. So remember back when I was talking about executing, monitoring, and controlling? In monitoring and controlling at the end, when you're looking at the work performance information and you're analyzing the reports, you're kind of deciding whether or not you need to make a change. And this is where integrated change control comes into play. So integrated change control first identifies if there needs to be a change or not, as I mentioned. Then the next step is to identify potential solutions or possibilities of changes that could be made. Now, of course, you got to keep in mind when you're doing that, if there's any constraints like budget or time, you need to make sure if that it's not going to be a severe impact, but if it is, what are you going to do to mitigate that impact, and so forth. Now, in the real world, we generally don't need to have internal approval because everyone knows why we're doing that. But in the PMBOK, you do have to take the steps of actually getting internal approval just so that everyone knows what's going to happen and what's going to change. Then, of course, you take your change request to the Change Control Board or the CCB, which then reviews and tries to understand what it is you're trying to do, what you're trying to implement, what was the best solution, and what changes are going to be made. Then that leads into the decision of whether they approve that change or don't. If they don't approve the change, then you're kind of stuck, or you got to find another way to, you know, um, implement change in a different manner. Maybe you have to go back and reinvent the wheel a little bit in terms of your solution. But if your change request is approved, then you could move forward in applying that change. But then also you have to update your documents such as your project management plan, because in the PMBOK you always have to perform to the most current project management plan. And if you make a change, you got to update that project management plan to reflect that change, or else you're just going to keep working off of obsolete, documents that, you made a change to in the first place. So with that said, that is the basics of project management. I hope that this was a clearer stream. So if it is a clearer stream, then the first stream is going to be rid of, because I don't want to have people wondering what I'm trying to say. But I will open the floor up now to any questions and answers that you may want to pose. I'll give you a moment to type your question in the chat. If not, after a couple seconds, I'm just going to end the live stream, and I look forward to seeing you in the next live stream with our first project that we're going to analyze. So I'm just going to give a moment if you have any questions. Okay, so I don't see any questions. So thank you again for joining. It's much appreciated, and I will see you in my next stream. Thanks. Have a good evening.